Good evening. I'm Dr. Ellie Murphy, and today we'll discuss how occupational therapy practitioners can support the sensory needs of students in the classroom. To get started, you should have already completed your required reading, over which we will now take a quiz. The required reading was Sensory Integration Approaches for Children and Youth with an Occupational Therapy Practice. Go ahead and pause on this slide and click the link to take today's quiz. Once you're done with the quiz, I would like to encourage you, if you haven't already, to read this recommended supplemental reading, especially the article by Pillar et al. In 2026. These are both really great resources for OT practitioners practicing in pediatrics, and they give a really good overview of the evidence behind the current sensory interventions that are commonly used. So, highly recommend using those to complete your assignment, at least, even if you haven't read them already. So, what is sensory processing? What does this mean? Essentially, it's how the body's nervous system receives, interprets, and responds to sensory information. So the environment is constantly giving us sensory information that our nervous systems need to process and use to make decisions, interact with the environment, and complete our daily activities. AOTA, in their position statement that you guys have read for a required reading, defines sensory integration as the neurological process people use to organize information received through the body's sensory systems and produce purposeful and adaptive responses to the environment. The key words there being purposeful and adaptive, right? So if our responses are not purposeful or are maladaptive, that's where we need help. And we see that a lot in pediatric populations, but it does occur across the lifespan that some individuals will have difficulty processing or responding properly or safely to sensory input, and that can impact occupational performance in a lot of different ways. So these are just a few ways that sensory integration or sensory processing challenges can impact occupational participation in children specifically. So pretty much any area of occupation can be impacted by sensory processing challenges. In kids, we see it a lot in academic performance, social participation, any kind of participation in routines or ADLs, self-care, all of these things are affected. And then as kids get older, we tend to see it, affect other things more like IADLs, health management, that sort of thing. Work eventually, if they get to that point, and they're still having challenges, they'll see impacts in those. So today we are going to focus specifically on school performance. So in the school, sensory processing can affect any of these interactions or any of these occupations, rather. So we typically think of sensory processing as affecting children's ability to sit still and listen to a lesson in the classroom. And that is the most obvious example, but it's far from the only way that sensory processing can affect kids in the school system. So we do see, sometimes we'll have issues sitting still, issues behaving in class, issues completing assignments on time. We'll see issues in executive function, so issues, with time management, with sustained attention, working memory, stuff like that can be affected by sensory processing as well as the less obvious things, right? So sensory processing might affect a kid's ability to do their ADLs, like toileting and, eating, that sort of thing at school. The cafeteria is a very sensory rich environment. It's a busy environment, right? So mealtime can be affected by sensory processing challenges. And then just general peer interactions, right? So are they impacting their peers' education? Are they impacting, how the people around them are learning? How are their playground interactions, right? Are they able to play appropriately and interact appropriately with their friends, right? All of that is affected by sensory processing. So it's not a little bit, it's a lot broader than simply, can they sit still and listen? So how can we help? How can you as a CODA help? So the first tier of intervention in the school system is the organizational or school level. So as a certified occupational therapy assistant, you are an occupational therapy practitioner that has significant expertise in sensory processing, right? So you can help provide these universal strategies to your school district or to, your school building or whatever the organization is that you're working in that can positively impact the learning environment for all students, right? So tier one is this organizational level universal interventions that are affecting all of the students in the organization rather than just one or two students specifically. So these are top-down interventions that, they are district-wide or school-wide, building-wide, that sort of thing. An example would be providing education to all the staff in the building about sensory processing and how they can make their classrooms more supportive of their students' sensory processing needs. So that's gonna benefit all of the staff and all of the students in the school, not just a few. Tier two is honing in just a little bit to the small group or classroom level. So this is, we're focusing in a little bit more on a smaller group here, but we're still not to the individual level. So this can be stuff like providing alternative seating options for all the students in the classroom, providing intermittent movement breaks, giving kindergartners more recess than, you give fourth graders, that sort of thing. It's not as specific as individual treatments are, but it's not universal learning strategies the way that tier one interventions are. Tier one and tier two should always be tried first to provide the least restrictive learning environment for all the children. If there are children whose needs are not met by tier one or tier two interventions, then it's time to escalate things to tier three, right? So this is where we see individual adaptations for individual students. So this is going to be stuff like seeing a kid every week for 30 minutes or an hour for individual therapy sessions. It'll be things like sensory diets, just any kind of sensory integration intervention that you provide directly to a single student. So, and this applies to beyond sensory integration to any kind of intervention, right? So again, we start from the top down. We start from tier one. These are universal learning strategies. We hone into the classroom or group level with tier two. And then if they still need extra support, we go to tier three, right? So I've got a few examples there. I would encourage you to pause at this point and write down 2 to 3 examples for each tier of other interventions you can think of that would support sensory processing in the school system. So go ahead and pause and do that here. Okay, so for intervention planning, we always want to start with our conceptual practice models or frame of reference, right? This is the scaffolding that you're going to use to design your OT interventions to support your students' needs. So we'll use the PEO model, for example. So starting with the P, the person factors. What do you know about the child? What are their strengths? What are their challenges? What makes them shine? What challenges them and makes things harder for them? What do we know about them? So you'll want to collaborate with the teacher, any other therapists that work directly with the child, and if possible, collaborate with the parent to get this information. Other things you can do are reading the evaluating therapist's notes or read the previous treatment notes from another therapist that's worked with the child. Moving on to the E, the environment. What do you know about the environment? What is their classroom like? What environmental supports are in their classroom? What environmental barriers are in their classroom? What environments in the school system outside of the classroom are challenging for them? How is PE? How is the cafeteria? How is the playground? What supports and barriers exist in those other environments? What about the lunch line when you're waiting for lunch? What about coming into school in the morning or out in the evening? What about those environments is helpful and what isn't so helpful? And what can we do to make them more supportive? Then we're going to think about what occupations are impacted. So get specific. What are they needing help with? We must meet their needs in a way that supports not just their sensory regulation, but also their school performance, right? So that's the key thing we have to remember is, we need them to be successful in school, successful academically, successful socially, and successful in any way in the school system. A key part of intervention planning is collaboration. Interprofessional collaboration should always be just clear, straightforward as possible. It should be as frequent as possible. You should keep an open line of communication with the teachers, and it should be mutually respectful. So I would encourage you to introduce yourself to any new teachers at the beginning of the year. Introduce, what you're trying to do, what your role is on the team, answer any questions that they have, and be curious about what their needs are and what their role is. You also want to consider the impact of any interventions, especially those tier one and tier two interventions on the teacher and the other students in the class, right? So we want to be supporting everybody involved so that our students have the best experience possible. I'd encourage you to pause here. This case example will be used for the assignment that we're going to move on to here. So pause here and just look at this. Respond to the prompts on the following slides on a Word document, and we're going to turn that into Canvas and use the previous slide, the case example, to craft your responses. So pause here and look at these prompts, but I want you to choose a conceptual practice model, describe a tier two intervention for the client on the previous slide, and describe 2 direct interventions, so those tier 3 interventions that you could provide to him that would help him, and then describe how you would grade them up or down as needed. Here are our references, and once again, I would encourage you to look over each and every one of those and absorb that information as best you can and use it to help your future clients. I hope this was helpful and let me know if you have any questions.